Right, hello everyone. Welcome to the session on monitoring and indicators for open research. My name is Neil Jacobs and I'm head of the UK Reproducibility Network's Open Research Programme, and I think we're all delighted to be here at the RLUK conference today. We've got some really interesting short talks, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and conversation and discussion after that. But first, I'd like to ask my panel to introduce themselves, if I pass the mic down.
Hi, I'm Jenny Adams, Open Research Manager at the University of Sheffield.
Hello, I'm actually taking place of Lorien Williamson, but I'm Radek, full name Radosław Pajur. I'm Research Services Consultant at the University of Leicester.
Hey everyone, my name is Etienne Roche. I am a professor at the University of Reading, and I am the UKRN institution lead over there.
Hi everyone, I'm Ian Thrynaskiewicz. I'm Director of Open Research Solutions at PLOS Public Library of Science.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So I'll kick us off with a very short introduction to what we were doing and why we were doing it, and then each of us will spend 5 minutes talking about what each of us did in the pilots that we were involved in, and I'll wrap up with a few reflections from the UK Reproducibility Network perspective, and then there'll be some questions. So, that's what I just said. So, our aim within the Open Research Programme of the UK Reproducibility Network was, in part, to establish good practice in monitoring open research. So we were keen, as part of that programme, which has got 24 institutional partners in it, to enable those institutional partners to be able to better monitor open research practices. And by open research practices, we mean quite a wide range of things, and you'll hear about some of those shortly. It's certainly well beyond open access. But we also wanted, as part of the programme, to be able to monitor the impact that the programme itself was having. So that was another aspect of why we wanted to develop, if we could, some indicators that would tell us how well we were doing. So this is the timeline for the pilots as they ran. In 2023, we wanted to find out what the sector thought was a priority. So which aspects of open research does the sector want to monitor? We went through a call for priorities, we went through a prioritisation exercise, and we engaged both with institutions, because we're very much institution-led, but also with providers, with solutions partners who might be able to help us in monitoring those aspects of open research. And we went through that iteration a couple of times, which was worthwhile, but did take a little time. And then last year, we set up and ran the pilots, and that involved quite a lot of work, and I'll say a little bit more about how that work went in a minute. And this year, we hope to, well, we will be sharing the results, some of them today, but also at other events, a UKRN webinar on the 29th of May, for example. But we will hope to, if we find that we have some reliable ways of monitoring open research, to roll those out among the partners in the Open Research Programme. Because this was quite a large partnership, we wanted some principles on which the partnership and collaboration were based. We heard this morning that collaboration is one of the really important things that we need to do as a sector, and so that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And we thought we would start with some principles. Now, these were taken from or adapted from some principles that were developed in the Netherlands in a partnership between Dutch universities and Elsevier. We adapted them to a certain extent, and we have probably some reflections on how adequate these principles turned out to be. I'm not going to go through them, but I will point out that one major adaptation we made was that we were keen to use open data where possible to support these indicators, and that we were keen to avoid anything that might enable rankings to be developed from these indicators. So each of the so this was the set of priorities. These were the pilots that were done. The numbering, I know, isn't incremental, and that's because some of the pilots sort of came together halfway through or at the start. So we're talking about monitoring the fairness and openness of data, downstream effects of sharing data, the prevalence of data availability statements, the prevalence of pre-registration, and the use of author or contribution statements such as credit statements. So you can see the breadth of things that we were talking about when we were talking about open research. These are the institutions that were involved in the pilots. We were lucky enough to get 15 institutions all involved, all on a voluntary basis, and we'll come back to that, I think, in some of the reflections afterwards. It was an amazing response from those institutions, and these were the solutions partners that we were working with, to some extent Centre for Open Science, but certainly Digital Science, Elsevier, OpenAir, and PLOS and DataSeer. And they all engaged very positively, but obviously those different organisations, and they engaged in different sorts of ways. So we're currently, the pilots are currently drafting individual reports, and I will be involved in writing up a big final report, which will look at there being a reasonably precise definition of what the indicator is, some sense of what data would underpin that indicator, and what processing needs to be done with those data in order for them to create an indicator, some sense of what the narrative is within which that indicator could usefully sit in order for it to be properly contextualized and understood, and then some assessment of the quality, if you like, feasibility, validity, reliability and transparency, and some recommendations, and there certainly will be, on next steps to try and make this work better in the future. So that's where we are. We're currently writing up very busily, and I'll come back with some UKRN reflections after we've heard from the people who actually did the work. Jenny.
So, can everybody hear me okay? Fantastic. So, to pause on that first. So, the first pilot was about the fairness of data. FAIR being an acronym that stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So, it's about data not just being openly available, but being available in the best possible way that enables more people to find it, to get hold of it, and to do things with it. Okay. So the aim of this pilot was to explore the possibility of developing indicators to measure the fairness of data underpinning research publications. And one of the things that we did first of all was, and this is something that all of the pilots did actually, that was built into the process of this project, was an INORMS scope exercise, which the purpose of that framework is to think about what you actually want to measure and why, so that then when you go on to try to develop a way of measuring something, you're not just measuring what is easy to measure, the kind of low-hanging fruit, but you're actually trying to create a straight line from your values and your intentions to what you're actually ultimately measuring. So one of the things we reflected on was what research behaviours we're actually wanting to look into and investigate and encourage. So sharing data in ways, apologies for the typo, that best facilitate access and reuse. So that really is what I'm saying before. We don't just want to share data, but we want to actually make it usable by people. Providing metadata for discoverability, and ensuring that all contributions are fairly and transparently acknowledged. And when we were setting out to do this, to develop ways of measuring fairness, there were two main approaches that we had in mind. One would be to look at data in repositories and think how well have people deposited this data, how well have they documented it, how fair is the data in repositories. But what we decided to do was not to take that path, because if you go straight to the repository, you're bypassing all the data that hasn't been put in a repository. You're kind of skewing the picture in a sense because that data is already findable. So we wanted to start with publications, and what we can do from looking at a publication to work out, is the data that underpins that work made fair? Has it been put in a repository? Has it been appropriately documented? Has it got a license? Things like that. So this is why we wanted to start with publications. So this is a sort of visualization of the process that we went through. I'm not sure how visible it is on that screen, so I will just try and summarize it briefly. So we did the INORMS scope exercise, and we also conducted a literature review where we looked at what were the different ways that people had already attempted in terms of monitoring or evaluating the fairness of data. And both of those processes fed into the identification of a set of sub-indicators that we wanted to focus on. So within the F, A, I, and R of FAIR, there are various different components, and we couldn't focus on all of them. So we decided to choose ones that covered the different components and were reasonably indicatory. And these are the ones listed in pale blue on here. So things like the data set has a PID, a persistent identifier. The metadata contain the access level and access conditions of the data. Dataset metadata includes provenance information, which would then facilitate appropriate context and understanding of that dataset. And dataset metadata includes reuse license. So these are the sort of shortlist that we drew up. And then of that shortlist, we created a kind of specification that indicated, you know, if we want the dataset metadata to include a reuse license, what conditions need to be satisfied in order for us to say that that condition has been met. And then we shared our specification with the providers who were Digital Science, Elsevier, OpenAir, and PLOS DataSeer, had a bit of discussion about that and sort of finessed the specification. Then the providers worked to develop those sub-indicators. They returned our test data set to us. Our test data set was all of the publications, the open access articles from 2023. So data from our repositories that we then gave to the providers. They gave it back with us with a bunch of extra fields added relating to the sub-indicators of FAIR that they were able to provide data on. And then we tested what had come back and evaluated that to try and determine how accurate it was and what were the additional issues that we needed to explore and consider in terms of future work. Okay, so in terms of the findings, so different providers were able to provide data on different ones of those sub-indicators of FAIR. But the overall set that various providers were able to provide detail on were these ones listed here. So the dataset has a PID, mostly a DOI, but not exclusively. Dataset metadata includes creator, title, data identifier, publisher, publication date, summary, and keywords. We refer to this as complete metadata set, so as a kind of minimal metadata set that documents that data set. Dataset metadata specify access level and conditions. So, for example, if the data wasn't open, was there a process that was referred to for how you could request that data? Dataset metadata includes the provenance information, so this would be things like the publication date, the creator, and dataset metadata includes license. And one of our providers also gave information on was data generated in the study by kind of looking for words that indicated that data was created. The reason that this is important is because for all of these categories, we need an appropriate denominator that isn't just all of the articles. Say 20% of them have a PID for a data set. That's only meaningful if data was created in the study in the first place, and also if it was possible for that data to be shared. So we've got these findings, we've got these categories on which it was possible to provide data, but there are a number of caveats and limitations. Problems that we discovered during the process, things that we realized we ought to have thought about when we were writing the specification but hadn't, etc., etc. So what we've ended up with is not a kind of set of indicators that can go out there into the world and produce knowledge on these various mechanisms. It's more of a preliminary piece of work with useful kind of signs as to how that work might proceed. So in terms of some of those limitations, we found that in some cases there was uneven accuracy in the data that was coming back from providers and issues with the kind of cleanness versus messiness of the data that came back. The process that we had for evaluating and analysing the accuracy of what came back to us wasn't perfect in itself. We were looking at whether the provider indicated that a feature was present, say data has a license, and we were checking whether that feature was present. But were we necessarily looking at the same things is a question that potentially undermines the accuracy of that process. In one provider, we only received positive results, so where a data set associated with that article had been found, so we weren't able to look at the negative results and check the accuracy of those. That was just for one provider. There's also a lack of one-to-one mapping between articles and data sets and licenses. This is something we should have given more thought to at the outset. A data deposit might have different licenses attached to the different components of that. An article might have some data that's available, some data that isn't, and isn't documented in a fair way. Additional steps will be needed to create the indicators, including creating that defined denominator that I was talking about a few moments ago, so that we make sure that if it's a percentage or a proportion that we're reporting back, that we have the bottom part of that correct, the what is it being measured out of, and we're not just measuring out of all of the articles. And also, in some cases, we felt that a bit more transparency might be needed from what the providers were giving us in terms of description of the methods. In order for us to create an indicator that could be reproduced in different contexts, a bit more detail on the step-by-step could have been useful. So we don't have working indicators, but we are not downhearted. We think that we've done some really valuable preliminary work that might usefully inform future work and also help the next people doing this to avoid some of the kind of things that perhaps we ought to have realised at the time. Okay, so apart from the need for further work in order to develop these indicators for fairness, we also observed a few things out of this checking process that were useful or could potentially be useful, in that we think there is a need for dialogue with journals and publishers to advocate for better quality, standardised metadata. You're hunting for a data availability statement. It could be here, it could be there, it could be called something completely random. We need standardisation in order to, not just to support these efforts, but supporting these efforts would be one of those outcomes of that standardisation if it were to occur. Dialogue with repositories would be useful to advocate for them including a full range of metadata fields at deposit and perhaps mandating completion of those a bit more fully. And also engagement with researchers. So researchers are more aware of the importance of including a clear data availability statement when referring to a data set, giving the persistent identifier rather than another URL. Authors need to check that the persistent identifiers are correct and resolved to the data set, and try to avoid data is available on request if possible, or if it does need to be used, explaining how to request access, ideally in a metadata-only record. So those were some of the points that we could perhaps take forward in a less project-focused sense. And then a couple of general reflections. The project was really ambitious, which is good because we had to go into it kind of all guns blazing. But that then created challenges from the workload perspective, as Neil kind of nodded to earlier. We also found that as it transpired, some of the projects seemed to come before other ones logically. So there was a pilot on data availability statements that it would have been really good if that had already taken place before the work on FAIR, and then we could draw on the work that was conducted there. So sequential ordering perhaps would be helpful for another project of this kind. And also to make sure that all stakeholder priorities are completely aligned, because it's not necessarily the case that libraries and some commercial providers, for example, are going to have perfectly aligned priorities in terms of what's produced out of a pilot like this one. But I think that's it for me, and I'm going to hand over to Radek.
Yeah, I think that would make sense.
Okay, hello everyone. You probably worked out I'm not Lorien. She sends the apologies again, and you probably, another thing is you're probably happy that my big head is actually out of the screen and you can see the slides now. I didn't think about placing myself in the middle of the screen there. So my name is Radoslav Pajer, but feel free to call me Radek, everybody else does. And today I'm going to be placing the library lens on the pilot 4, which initially started as a pilot 4 and 5, so it was two pilots merged in together. And I think I'm in the right place because I've been involved and co-leading that on the Leicester side right from the beginning. So the actual pilot started as two pilots, like I've already mentioned. The pilot 4 was initially just to detect the presence of data availability statements in journal articles. And the pilot 5 was to sort of classify them in terms of how good they are. So doing some quality checks on the data availability statements. And we've had a really good team, I think, of the collaborating institutions. I mean, we've been co-leading this with the colleagues from the University of Glasgow. And shout out here to Valerie McCutcheon and Mick Eady from Glasgow. And we had a great partners from Bristol, Leeds, Manchester, Reading, Sheffield, and Surrey University, and we collaborated with the providers such as Digital Science, Elsevier, PLOS Datasphere, Ian, and OpenAir as well. So just bearing in mind that this is a pilot, we're not sort of gunning down for having definite answers. We're trying to scope what can be done at the current in the current time slot. So as Jenny said, we've had a common data set, which was a snapshot of from our repositories of all of the publications that were published in 2023 and deposited to the repositories at the time of supplying the data to the commercial partners. And we've started the study, the pilot, as I guess every other sort of pilot crew, from having a thorough brainstorm and literature search, what's already available on data availability statements, the classification and what questions we may actually target within that pilot. And I think we nailed it down to whether there are any automated ways of detecting those, whether there is any sort of classification already published and available that we can automatically apply, and can we standardize those methods, and what will be the best sort of method to then inform all of the community about those findings. So in terms of reflections and recommendations, I think a big role in the success of that pilot or pilots was the community and the communication we've established, because we had a shared space thanks to to the whole panel leading that. We had a shared space on the Google Drive, and we've been all of the actions were sort of very transparent in a way. We shared all the documents. We've established a frequent touch-up points in terms of meetings with all the collaborators and the project partners as well. There were I think there were fortnightly meetings where we updated on the progress of the pilots and further actions. So a couple of, which worked well. So a couple of reflections here. So we think in overall the community approach to this was great. We had a bit of challenges in terms of complexities in discovering data availability statements, because it's not standardized where those access statements are within the journal. Some are part of metadata, some have dedicated space in the journals, and some are just in supplementary materials. So there were different approaches to detecting those, whether manual checks, text minings, or automated approaches from our providers. And there needs to be a sort of a common ground established, and I think we found this in terms of mapping. That's what we propose, at least, to mapping that data access availability statement classifications. But there is still a need for the automated tools to be available widely in the sector and roll them out. Obviously, a lot of these participating institutions were in the different places. So when we're looking at the return from the commercial partners of that data set, which they've analyzed and added their sort of lens on the results, some institutions already been sort of recording the prevalence, at least, of DAS in the repository, so they could cross-check the return of the data with what they've already have the information. The others were doing the random spot check to actually verify where we are. There were issues with detecting DAS as well, in terms of what version of the article was looked at, because in some instances the accepted manuscripts don't involve data access statement or availability statement, if you like, and it's just a publisher version which actually has that statement embedded in it. So we've been scoping what is possible, and I think there is a couple of recommendations, and we've already implemented some locally at Leicester. So we've rolled out a new open access policy, which was approved in June 2024, and we've actually included mandatory requirement of having data access or availability statements within every article that has any affiliation with the University of Leicester. Definitely, we also introduced a custom metadata field in our institutional repository where we, when we are validating the publications through our repository system, we are looking for, manually, unfortunately for now, we are looking for those data availability statements, and we can include them as part of the metadata. And looking at the results from and returns from our providers and partners, we can actually see what are the practices within our community, whether it differs between the colleges. It's not so much for comparing the results and comparing, who does better, who includes more and follows the policies better. It's just to direct the sort of tailored advocacy and how we can enhance that sort of cultural change to actually, first of all, share the data so we can comply with the FAIR principles, but also to report where the data is, and for us as an institution to know where the data is actually published at the moment and how we can improve our advocacy to advise the researchers what are the best and whether there is any room of improvement, what repositories to use. So yes, if you have any follow-up contacts, please get in touch with Lorien, who sends apologies, and I'm sorry she can't be here, or Valerie at the University of Glasgow. And that's it.
So I'm not a librarian. I do read books a lot as a researcher. And so I engaged into these pilots in a very different way. So I was co-leading pilot 3 on the downstream effects of data, meaning that we were interested to look at the data reuse over time, and it was very exciting for us, because I think this is really important to be able to visualize, explore, and understand the impact of research generally. But all the more exciting that it was also probably a bit more challenging, because it didn't come with just a ready specification of a number that we wanted to look at. It was not the prevalence of data or something a bit more concrete. It was we had to define what we wanted to look at. So the institutions that were involved in the pilot were the University of Reading, Liverpool, Glasgow, and we also had Elsevier, plus Datasphere, Digital Science, Open Air. I'm forgetting someone. I think Digital Science, yeah. No, they weren't involved. So, because it was more of a research-y project, it was a bit unclear where we were going. So at the very beginning, we established what the scope was. We understood really quickly that identifying data reuse was not something easy to do. And so we looked at 2 different strands of work. One was to develop new algorithms to look at data, to identify data reuse in publications. And the other one was to visualize and understand the pathway over time of a particular publication and data publication. So these 2 work strands went along in parallel and clearly mimicked, I think, the kind of priority that the partners had on the pilot. Obviously, the providers had they were constrained by the resource they had and the priorities themselves of what they were interested in and what they were, what the algorithms that they already had in place and what they were willing to develop. Me, as a researcher, and the institutions were a bit less constrained, I think. And so we explored what the institutions were interested in, what kind of questions we were interested in to answer. In the end, the results from the pilots followed these 2 strands. We have developed a set of algorithms to identify data reuse in papers. And so maybe Ian could say something about the algorithms that PLOS and DataSeer developed themselves to dig and mine the papers themselves to identify instances of data reuse. And on the side of the institutions, we developed an algorithm or a set of algorithms that allow us to take a specific publication as a seed and then explore over time the publications that cited this paper or this data source and allowed us to answer specific questions about this journey of citations, such as the borrowing of these data sets and how it would have moved across disciplines, who have reused these data sets. Has it been reused by specific stakeholders in the in academia or research? Has it crossed boundaries from academia to industry or into grey literature? These sort of things. I think that the pilot was really interesting. It was very exciting, but it also posed significant challenges, I guess, because it had this more researchy nature. I think not everyone managed this uncertainty in the same way. I am a researcher myself, so it was bread and butter for me to sort of go ahead without really knowing where I was going. But others probably would have preferred to have a more clear-cut specification document. And I think that's it. So thank you.
So just as a quick bit of context, so I think we'll just talk about why did we get involved as a provider, how did it go, what did we learn, suggestions. So as a bit of context, PLOS, we've been doing things in the indicator space since about 2021. We use them to support our own goals and strategies that are about improving adoption of open science practices in at least the content that we publish. And so we'd previously been monitoring data sharing, code sharing, and preprint posting since 2022. But to actually deliver that, we worked with a startup called DataSeer, and hence we thought, why not collaborate on these pilots? So while PLOS is a provider in the context of these pilots, we don't have anything to sell. So our goals for being involved are maybe overlapping, but perhaps sometimes different from the other providers. So first and foremost, the pilots there were a reassurance that we're not the only ones that were thinking about this problem. But then I guess three more specific goals that I would articulate. Firstly, it was to collaborate with institutions to make progress on indicators together as a way of long-term improving the practices that we care about. We also wanted to get feedback to inform development of new indicators that aligned with the institutional priorities, their needs as well as those of researchers, and also things that we've been thinking about as well. And sort of more as a secondary goal, but as part of our own work, we've been sharing openly the results of the indicator work that we've been doing, and we thought, well, we might be able to increase the amount of data that's available from these kind of efforts that might be used for meta-science or other applications. So considering each of those three goals, we've certainly made progress on all of them, in particular the first two. For indicators to have wider adoption, we need common definitions and requirements for what we actually want to measure, agnostic of the different tools for creating solutions to do that measurement. And the pilots, particularly around research data that we've heard about, highlighted how important but also difficult that shared definitional work is. And it's not easy to do, but I think we should celebrate the progress we made, even if we don't have all the solutions that we want yet. I'll also mention the pre-registration pilot as well, pilot 6. This was particularly rewarding for us because it aligned with an indicator that was sort of in our roadmap already, but we hadn't done it yet. And so it was a great incentive to do that in conjunction with institutions that were really engaged in giving feedback on the requirements, so like what is it we want to know, and it was a good incentive for us to get DataSeer to help deliver some of the technology to do it. So for the third goal, making indicator data publicly available, this is still a work in progress, but leads me on to some other thoughts on sort of benefits and challenges. So from our perspective, we want to see as much as the results and data and methods of these analysis that we've conducted shared openly. But that needs to be done responsibly, sort of pointing back to the principles that Neil mentioned. So ensuring, for example, we're not promoting uncontextualized comparisons or rankings of institutions or journals or any other entities or groups, as well as the various legal and ethical and moral considerations around data sharing. But also around the data, it is really fundamental to have the transparency in the methods, but also the accuracy of these indicators, as well as any limitations to facilitate trust in the results. But as we get into the depths of the reporting, which is happening at the moment, certainly it will be glad to see as much information being shared from these pilots as possible. I think just to really highlight again, though, I think the principles and also the partnership principles that were established were really, really important. I think it really incentivized all the providers to show up to the conversations with good intent, even though theoretically lots of competing, often commercial priorities, but it did really work people did, from different organizations all share information, and we did get to learn from what everyone was doing. So I thought that was a real win. In terms of suggestions, a couple of thoughts. I would really highlight the iNorm scope process, which we've already heard about, so emphasizing the importance of first thinking around indicator development. What do we value? What do we really want to know, and why? And to do that sort of independently from whatever data or tools that might exist to measure those things. And I would suggest if we did something similar again, to have even more focus on that and keep the providers out of the conversations while that's happening. I'm not saying that did happen, but really focus on that. Because it can be easy to be constrained in indicator development by what is measurable, so whether it's what's in the publication metadata or whatever. Data availability statements are one that I think is quite close to some of the things that I've worked on in the past. So they're increasingly measurable, but I think we live in a world where what gets measured gets done. It's often becoming clear that having a statement around data availability doesn't lead to data availability unless there are lots of other things happening to make that happen. And I'd like to assume that data sharing is the thing we care a bit more about than the statements. Just briefly on Pilot 3 to connect with what Etienne mentioned. So I think this is an example of, yes, it was much more exploratory, and it led, in our case, to the development as PLOS, a set of solution-agnostic requirements for how we might think about data reuse and sort of how we might structure that as a measure, including information on whether data is being reused in a particular study, but also how. And that sort of how, more qualitative information, is particularly tricky to actually come up with a solution for. And so it had never been done before, but sort of working with the pilot was an opportunity to define some requirements, get lots of community feedback, and then consequently work with DataSeer in our case, to start developing a novel approach to doing that, which incidentally uses a large language model. So although we're not in the AI session, we've got a little smattering of AI. So final comment, and I'll sit down. I think if we do more of this, I'd love to see more involvement from meta researchers. They're often at the forefront of the work at thinking and doing this, but obviously need different approaches in terms of how we support and engage them. Thank you.
I'm aware of time, so I'm going to wrap up with a few sort of closing reflections, because I'd love to hear your questions and comments on what we've done. So we've had 6 different pilots. They've all had very diverse experiences. I think it's fair to say that we were very ambitious, and we didn't meet our ambitious goals. We don't have a set of indicators that we're simply going to roll out across the institutions, but we've learned a huge amount in what we have done. All sorts of lessons about timescales, sequencing. Those partnership principles were really, really useful. And then came the Barcelona Declaration on Open Research Information, which UKRN signed. And so if we were going again, we might look at those partnership principles and think about, whether those were the right sorts of things. But I think they did serve their purpose. Extraordinary voluntary efforts, absolutely. It was if you think about what we've achieved, if we were in a large Horizon Europe project, we would be proud of what we'd achieved, and we've done this with no resources, which I think is an amazing achievement, frankly. And yes, I think we now have a strong evidence base for future work by all stakeholders. But I'm going to stop there.
So I'm really interested in everything that all of you said, but I was interested particularly around the difference between kind of what we want to know and what we identified. You've presented that we perhaps don't have indicators from these pilots yet, but do we have a better idea on those tangible things like the data accessibility statements? Do we have a better idea of what we don't know than we knew before? And then maybe more on pilot 3's side, on the kind of more intangible things, do we have a directionality of the things that we'd like to know and the next steps and next directions? I'm Alice. I'm from the UKRN project, and I actually work on some of these indicators projects as well. So I'm from the University of Liverpool.
Thanks. I'd really like your question, but it's a very difficult question to answer, I think. I think that's mostly what interested me in these pilots. I'm an applied statistician by trade, and I have a reluctance to using rankings and league tables and things like that. And I know how these statistics can lead to, I mean, any statistics can be used to misuse or things like that. And so I was very wary of creating yet another indicator that could be misused. And I think one of the gaps I think that working on these pilots for me has highlighted is precisely that difficulty to navigate and so this is probably why we steered the pilot towards merging both quantitative information such as the citation trees as well as the qualitative information related to the nature of the data reuse and creating a narrative about these things. So I think that's the one thing that I would pull from these pilots.
Yes, absolutely. They were all sort of researchy projects, and so research is about reducing uncertainty. And so I think we do now have a much better sense. If I'm going to come over old Donald Rumsfeld, we have fewer unknown unknowns. We have more known unknowns, and we have some known knowns. So we've made some progress, and I think we now, I think, could usefully engage. We know there's conversations, for example, going on in the Research Data Alliance and lots of other places, and we can, through partners such as OpenAir, who are plugged into those things, and through the European Open Science Cloud, I think really make some useful progress on some of the pilots that we've done. I think some of the work that we've done and that we've heard about around pre-registration and credit, which we haven't heard about today, but have been really quite pioneering, and those have been quite promising, I think, in terms of moving towards something that we might be able to use as indicators with some caveats. But working out what it is that we want to measure and therefore what accuracy means is going to be an ongoing challenge for all of us, I think.
Yeah, I would just add to that very briefly that I think we've clarified the questions that we need to ask and the considerations that form part of that process. And I think maybe in some cases we've identified that things that we would like to measure would actually be very difficult to measure. So I would be keen that any ultimate output of this process maintains a sense of those unknowns or those unknowables, rather than just grasping the presences that have been made visible.
I just want to add something on, on top of what everybody said. I mean, not only by the statistics and the need of narrativeness around those, it's the greatest example is the pilot 4 and 5, which are combined, because you cannot just look at the number of the data availability statements, because you can have hundreds of just data available on request. It's more the quality of those. So it's really that sort of quality over quantity in my head. So I agree with Etienne that you actually need that sort of narrative, and statistics can be misleading. So it's not only about the number, but also a bit of narrative. So it cannot be a dry KPI, basically, for the institutions.
Any other questions?
Thanks. Susie Cheek, University of Bristol. I just was wondering about whether the increased importance of the PCE element of the REF and the need to evidence certain aspects of research culture both is helpful in the sense that it underlines the importance and the need for indicators, but also perhaps whether it introduces an element of pressure or urgency to the work you're doing.
I think the anxiety that I have about that is that we need to do it right, and that there might be a rush to what can be achieved and what can be measured easily, that then might also skew towards some disciplines rather than others, some kinds of research rather than others, and lead to inequity in the way that that research is regarded and recognised as a result. I think we also need to be cautious of false promises in this space. And particularly of kind of products that potentially appear to offer us some of what we're looking at here. But what we've actually discovered is that this is a lot more complicated than a nice pie chart that appears from nowhere that says, 60% of your research outputs have a PID for a data set. So I think there is reason for caution in our response to those PCE indicators, and I hope that they will maintain that kind of broadness and flexibility that has been already indicated from what we've seen so far of that. Anyone else?
I think you said it brilliantly. Any other questions, comments?
Thank you, Gareth Cole, Loughborough University. I was just wondering, particularly on the pilot around the data reuse, how do I phrase this without it sounding leading? What were the, how good were the reuse practices of researchers?
Bad.
Yeah, okay. So I didn't, yeah.
But officially, I don't know, because it is actually really hard to measure data reuse. So it is probably better than I think. But the aim of the pilot wasn't to benchmark anything. It was to define a method on how we could do that and explore the questions that would come up. So, yeah, that's...
Yeah, and sorry, very quick follow-up if I may. Did your algorithm manage to pick up any, you said you were able to track kind of reuse across disciplines. Were you able to track differences of reuse within those disciplines, if that makes sense?
Yes. So the prototypical example I give is one of my paper where I published in psychology, or that paper was published in psychology, and I could track over time how it would have been used in other papers across disciplines. And so I think I was lucky because I don't think that's necessarily easily identifiable for all papers. And specifically looking at data reuse, it doesn't necessarily need, I mean, a data set doesn't necessarily need to be reused in other disciplines, right? It's more the quality and so on. It just so happens that I've been very interdisciplinary all my career, and that what I've done in that paper with this particular set of data is applicable to other disciplines, and therefore it lends itself really nicely to a narrative about cross-disciplinary things. But I think Ian probably has something to say as well.
Yeah, I can't say a lot about the quality of reuse, which is based on, we have sort of a prototype that analyses about 5,000 articles, and what was really surprising is the frequency of reuse. So nearly half of the papers we analysed had some form of reuse, but the challenge is how that reuse is expressed is very rarely as a citation to a data set in a repository. Sometimes it's a citation of a paper, sometimes it's an implicit reference. So that was a really revealing thing that we're sort of writing stuff up now. So it's how often it happens, but potentially the lack of recognition for it was well, it's a concern, something to think more about.
And hence, you know, and hence, I guess some of our recommendations are going to be around how we better monitor the evidence that, or use the evidence that's already there to monitor what it is that we're interested in, and how we improve what's already there in order to be able to better monitor it in the future. Any other questions or yep.
I'm Gavin Beattie from King's College London. Initially, you were talking about wanting to develop indicators, but not wanting to provide data that could feed into league tables. I understand the very good reasons behind that, and I just wondered, was there any tension between that and between institutions being very concerned about their position? Just thinking about staying in the global top 50, getting into the global top 20 or whatever, because of the impact that has on student numbers and particularly international student recruitment, and how reliant we all are. And I was sort of struck by that, and it reminded me of some conversations we've had in my own institution, particularly looking at Coara and pushback we were getting, because there's a sort of league tables, oh no, and then the institution's going, yes, and trying to stay in the middle and saying, two things can be true. But I just wondered if that was the tension in the project.
So my sense, and I'll look to others to comment on this, my sense was that because we recognised that so early in the process as being a risk, and because we were all throughout all of the pilots so aware of it throughout, that it didn't become, an issue. There are all sorts of reasons why institutions were quite careful about what was publicly released, all sorts of reasons why some of the providers were quite careful about what is released. We're hoping for as much transparency as possible, but that's one of the reasons why we might think about that carefully. Any other comments on that?
No, I think you said it well. I think we were pretty open and honest with each other throughout. There weren't tensions per se, but it's true that we were very cautious about how we want to share things and so on. Mostly because we were very aware that any number we would produce is flawed. It was just a pilot. It's not a benchmark of any sort. So we didn't want to mislead anybody. So.